Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Hero Siege. This is a two-man development by people I quite frankly cannot pronounce, so I have to apologize for that. And it did come out on iOS and, of course, on Android, but it found its way to PC. Promises to be an arena combat game with some heavy roguelike elements. So let's see what's exactly going on with it. You saw the options menu, that's it. It is, of course, not exactly what I'd class as a high-fidelity game, by any stretch. So you could probably get away with that, although resolution options are still nice regardless. Please bear that in mind if you happen to be making a game that looks like this. There's a shop! Don't worry, doesn't require any microtransactions whatsoever. It actually uses these crystals which you earn during the game, and it allows you to get a whole bunch of stuff, in fact. And you can get clothing, including that, so that's nice. It's not all cosmetic. Pretty much all of the clothing stuff is, for fairly obvious reasons. Is that a pyramid head? It is. Huh. Is that... Wow, that's Arthur's. Okay. Yes. Some of these are fairly amusing. I've got to give him credit for that. And I'm pretty sure... That looks like Walter White. I don't know. Anyway... If you buy accessories, then that will actually give you something in-game. Random item, money, crystal key, so on and so forth. Again, though, there's no way for you to actually buy these outside of the game. So, it's more of a translation of the cash shop from the iOS and mobile versions to this, but taking away all of the nonsense and making sure that you can get everything for in-game currency. Okay, so I have a couple of characters here. There are actually several types of characters. 4 in total, a 5th is on the way, as you can see right there. They each do different things. They each have their own skill tree and their own attack. Now, you can lose and keep leveling up your character. In fact, the game seems to be designed around that. Or you could play hardcore mode, which would make you suicidal, one would assume. And show you the Pyromancer here. It's my highest leveled up character. And there are 4 entire acts, although this game is kind of rock hard. I've never got past the first one. I believe that is deliberate. You're supposed to keep leveling up until you've actually got the power to do it. So, controls are extremely simple, needless to say. You've got an ability, every now and again. You've got an item and a potion. Alright, I got a token of luck as my item. Okay, kill stuff. This is your attack. This is your only attack. However, there are a bunch of passive abilities that are kicked in as well. I need to be a little bit careful here because I'm pretty sure this doesn't actually pause it. You'll notice this talent tree right here. It's going to unlock some passive abilities as you go through, and you'll also be able to level up your stats to make you tougher, do more damage, and so on and so forth. Now, you might be wondering, well, where does the roguelike element come into play? Well, the levels are randomly generated. They all have something in common. They use kind of the same tile set depending on which area you happen to be in. And they all have well, I say potions in chests. They just have chests in general. They've probably got potions in them, but just chests in general. We've got this area right here, which is where the boss will spawn. They've usually got 4 gates, which will spawn enemies. And they're going to spawn various waves at you. Aside from that, though, they randomize things. Put a bunch of crates in your way, put a bunch of traps in your way. You can actually use the traps to kill your enemies as well. But for the most part, the game involves a lot of walking backwards, as I think you can very clearly see here, holding down the fire button. This is certainly the weakness of it, a rather large weakness at that, when dealing with an audience that perhaps is looking for something that's got a little bit more combat depth than that, because this game doesn't. It does not at all. It, in fact, relies very much so on the aspect of the random generation of the roguelike stuff, because honestly, outside of that, game's combat's barely got anything going for it. The items that you get are randomized every time you go into it, so you can't really formulate a strategy, as it were, and the only items that you can get in-game are temporary boosts. So, as you earn gold within the levels, you'll be able to buy boosts within the shop. You should probably do that. They're fairly important. They disappear after you've died. And then, of course, when you die, you actually have to start the act all over again. Although, even though the enemies are roughly the same, they do give you a different arena every time. As I said before, there is some random generation in it. So, we've already established that the combat system is extremely simple. Is it satisfying? It kind of is. It's mostly because almost everything they do is proc-based. And that sort of one-arm bandit approach to combat is actually quite satisfying. I think that if you've played an MMO and you've had a bunch of proc-based stuff, and when it all goes off at once, you feel great, right? Yeah, pretty much. You absolutely do, and this game has a similar thing going for it, but unfortunately that means the combat is completely lacking in any form of depth whatsoever. It's great that I can accidentally summon a couple of meteors and just run down everything in front of me. Yeah, that's entertaining. Don't get me wrong, especially when you do it on a large line of creatures. But that doesn't mean the game's smart by any stretch. And the actual skill involved seems to be fairly minimal, because all you can really do is, you know, well, go backwards. And, of course, draw your opponents onto traps, which is neat in and of itself. So you can do a little bit of dodging here and there, but there's really not all that much else to it. Is that enough for some people? I think it is for some. You've got to bear in mind this game did initially come out on mobile devices. And you could argue, okay, well, it's one of those sort of beer and pretzels or lunchtime games. Long time ago, there used to be games described as kind of beer and pretzels games, which could be beaten in a fairly short period of time. It didn't really require too much effort. Yeah? They were fun, they were satisfying, but they were certainly not games that were ridiculously skillful or had high learning curves. You can pick this game up in about 5 seconds. And I think there's a place for that, absolutely. But is there a place for it on PC? Certainly less so. It's not to say that the PC can't appreciate things like that. Yeah, totally. No question about that. But I think the demographic that's going to be playing games on PC is perhaps expecting something a little bit meatier. And we are talking about the platform of roguelikes here, so the little roguelike elements that you might find that would be extremely appealing on, say, an iOS device, maybe not so much here. There is an argument, though, that the simplicity of the title is kind of a beautiful thing, in the sense that it really boils down entirely to these individual little adventures that you go on. Yeah, you can't really do much. You can sort of strafe around and fight, and that's really about it. But every time you do a run, it's on a different map, you get different items, you fight some different enemies. There's a fairly large variety of bosses that all do different things, which, oh god, which I can absolutely appreciate. It's pretty good. It's good to have that level of variety. If it was the same boss every time, I think I'd be getting far more bored than I actually am. And I think it's a kind of game that you would play in small bursts. You do a run, and then maybe you come back to it the day afterwards because you feel like doing another run. But sustained play on a game like this? For crying out loud. Probably not. Probably not. As you can see, the sessions end fairly quickly. I'm going to switch on over to my Nomad here, who's a slightly different character. But those little adventures, sort of micro-adventures, I suppose, do have a level of satisfaction attached to them. Certainly. And you could have a great run where you get some awesome items and everything works out really well for you, or you could have a goddamn terrible run and it ends up with you dying on wave 2 or 3, and then you just start again and so on and so forth. It's got its moments, but it's very, very, very simple. There's also a price point consideration to be made. I actually read a thread on the forum explaining the price point. When this was on Greenlight, it was promised to be $5. And that's actually even more expensive, I think, than what it is on iOS and on Android, where it's much, much cheaper than that, which is fairly common for that particular marketplace. Now it's $10, and the dev justified it by saying, well, you know what, I added a ton more content since the Greenlight. And he did. You know, there's 4 classes, there are 4 whole acts, there weren't 4 whole acts previously. So, yeah, there's definitely an argument to say, hey, I added more, therefore I deserve more money. Unfortunately, I don't think most people would really agree. Yeah? I think that if you set up your game to have a higher point of entry, then you're going to end up selling less copies. At $5, I think this is the kind of game that a lot of people would buy simply on impulse. At $10, especially when there are a lot of really good games at $10 on Steam, even though that's not really a lot of money, I think you start to massively affect how many people are willing to just sort of jump on the game immediately without knowing what it is. And that's the harm I think you get from that. Now, a lot of people like to make the argument, yeah, well, if you have a lower price, more people will buy it, and look at those Valve statistics from years ago, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, I get, we get the Valve statistic idea, but we're also talking about sales here, not about initial price, because the initial price can only really go down. You can't really go up. Do you sell it at a lower price and then maybe sell the characters as separate DLC? You know, you added an extra character in, maybe you add the pirate in for $1 or something along those lines. Is that a better idea than selling initially for $10? And more to the point, is that even an argument? Okay, you added more content, we get that, but that's not really an excuse for doubling the price, and on iOS, you will have provided that update for free. Of course. So, don't necessarily think you can make that argument. I don't know if it's really going to actually convince all that many people. And I appreciate the work of the devs. You know, being a dev is hard work, and even making a game like this will have taken a significant amount of time. The dev was talking about working 16-hour days just to try and get the extra content up prior to the game's Steam launch. I appreciate that, and I have sympathy for it, but you are still trying to sell a video game. And to some people, $10 for this is a little bit much, because I mean, you could call it a phone game, but it doesn't really have the characteristics of a phone game. You know, it's an arcade game. You know, it's an arcadey arena sort of Smash TV crossed with a few minor roguelike elements sort of game, with some persistent progression in it. And randomized levels and things like secret dungeons, which you can find. Yeah. I mean, I'm having a reasonable time with it, but I am finding the combat ridiculously repetitive to the point where I almost feel like I want to swap out classes all the time, because I'm sick of... should we go? Yeah, let's go with that one. There we go. That's the only one we can go for, apparently. I want to swap out classes because I'm kind of sick of just holding the button down. Because that's all of these classes actually do. And the passives are entertaining, but... you know, I think they could have perhaps fleshed out the combat system more than they have. Added a few more things in. They've got an ability button. You barely use it for the most part. Add a few more ability buttons in here. You know, it's the PC release. You're talking about adding content for PC? Alright, well, why don't you add some functionality as well? Nobody's saying you can't do that. Looks like we're actually going to get onto the next level this time, which is nice. Playing as a melee character in this game, as you probably figured out, is actually a little bit tricky. You can take a lot of damage. You gotta be a little bit more precise. But this guy does have an ability where the further he runs, the more damage he does before the next swing. So I'll definitely take that. Alright, sweet. We're taking out the boss and we can head on to the next level. Oh, and I need a crystal key, and I don't have one. That's a... should have bought some prior to going into this, but I do get an item. Eternal life. Incidentally, it doesn't tell you anywhere what these items actually do. You've kind of got to figure it out for yourself. It gives you a little tip, but that's really about it. I assume this will just resurrect me after I go through this portal. It's fun in like 10 to 20 minute bursts, and it might be the kind of thing that you'd want to play on a phone instead. Just because I can totally imagine you waiting for a bus and playing around with this and seeing how far you get. Especially considering when you go back, you'll have earned a little bit more. That's cool. I'm alright with that. But, on PC, I think for $10, I need to ask a little bit more. More often than not, it's either this or something like Risk of Rain, which just seems to outstrip it in every possible respect. That's the level of competition you've got to deal with on a PC platform. It's definitely a good first effort. You know? I absolutely don't hate it. I have had fun with it. It's quite satisfying at times. Especially playing the Pyromancer and just mowing down a huge column of enemies with the Meteor passive ability. But there's not enough here, I think, to really engage many people. Especially not on a platform where you have a lot of options when it comes to both roguelike and roguelite games. But it's there, folks. Hero Siege for $10 or your regional equivalent. What I would suggest... well, maybe hold out. See what happens with his next update. See if we end up getting any more from the class side of things. If he beefs up the combat system or anything like that. And of course, you know, price. It's a easy consideration there. If it ends up on sale for $2.50, it's a much easier game to recommend, I feel. Although at $10, for some people, that's going to be a little bit too much. But, as I said, I don't hate it. It was a reasonably good time, although not compelling enough to really keep me playing for anywhere longer than 20 minutes at a time. But I have come back to it, just to do a run every once in a while. It's a nice little time waster. It definitely has its moments. But, well, you're on a platform where there's a hell of a lot of competition, so more often than not, for gamers these days who have limited time and even more limited budgets, you need to be a little bit more than a relatively good time. You need to have a little bit more than moments. You need to be engaging for hours at a time, perhaps, and the game is definitely too simplistic to actually pull that off. Hero Siege, ladies and gentlemen, currently available on Steam for $10, or your regional equivalent, also available on iOS and Android for significantly cheaper than that. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.